Holistically, are we really making better buildings today? My answer to that is no. Go get on a plane, go to your favorite place, look around at the architecture, and ask yourself, is the architecture we're making today as good as that architecture?
Are we too quick to turn to technology and novelty to solve today's most pressing challenges? Perhaps history and nature hold the answers to modern day dilemmas, particularly those related to environmental degradation. That is the stance architect, past AIA president, and now author Carl Elefante takes. And though he's been preaching that message for more than a decade now, he didn't begin his architectural career with that mentality. In fact, it was about midway through his career that an important shift occurred for him. He began to see historic buildings in a new light. Suddenly, they had something to teach him rather than the other way around. He began to see the inherent flaws in modern day cities and buildings, that they've been built around machines rather than people and planet. And he began to see how historic buildings actually addressed the carbon conundrum better than most of the buildings of the last half century. And now he's working to rally his peers to rethink some of the assumptions born out of the modern era. It was back in 2004 that you said the quote that you've really become so known for, that the greenest building is one that is already built. And it seems like back in 2004, there wasn't much discussion yet around embodied carbon, but at that point, had you already started to dig into that?
The terminology about embodied carbon actually did exist back then, and it was in 2003 that Ed Mazaria published his original article in Metropolis that sort of alerted architects to carbon. So that was actually out there, but frankly, that was not much on my mind. What was on my mind was embodied energy, and the topic of embodied energy had been talked about in the building reuse and the historic preservation world for a long time. And in fact, in 1980, the National Trust for Historic Preservation conference theme was about the embodied energy in existing and historic buildings. 1980. They had a poster which was a gas can that looked like a building. It just that whole sort of focus on the embodied energy. And when you think of it, the material resources, the energy resources, to say nothing of the human and financial resources that goes into building, it's just tremendous. I mean, buildings are just an incredibly giant investment in all of those things. And yet, in this country, we throw buildings out like at the drop of a hat. Just to give you two little facts about that. One is that the average year we demolish about 800,000 buildings in this country. 800,000 buildings. And then the other one that just blows my mind is that by tonnage, and let's admit that construction materials are heavy, but by tonnage, construction waste and demolition waste is more than double all municipal waste combined in this country. I can't even get my brain around that. It's so vast. So again, in our world, in the historic preservation world, just trying to alert people to the value of existing buildings and the importance of kind of starting with the reuse mindset rather than a replacement mindset is hugely important. And I'll just say one other thing about it, that as an architect doing preservation work and adaptive building work, the thing that I find most puzzling about it is that it's such interesting work. It's really challenging. You really have to, it gets very technical. It also, the design of bringing new and old together is just so fascinating. And it's interesting to me that still to this day, in architecture schools and in a lot of architecture firms, that simple idea that reusing buildings is fun design is still something that renders a lot of people speechless. They just have a hard time believing it.
I have so many questions even just around that. One is, why do you think that it's perhaps not as appealing to go the reuse or adaptive reuse route versus build new?
Oh, I can relate to this very personally. I went to architecture school because I wanted to design cool new stuff. I didn't have a social mission. I certainly didn't have a stewardship mission, in my mind at all. I thought designing things was cool, and I wanted to design cool stuff that I thought up. I totally get it. And, my journey of bringing historic preservation and green building, sustainable design together was one where I literally turned 180 degrees in my career doing that. I came into it as a green building guy, that I was going to green existing buildings, and I was really going to improve them by, you know, applying, kind of lead guidelines and things like that. That type of, uh, uh, what we do to buildings to make them follow green building guidelines. And I came away realizing that, there was certainly wisdom in those rating systems, but, uh, a lot of the existing buildings had their own wisdom to them. And I ended up coming away from 25 years of doing that, feeling like I had more to learn from the existing buildings than I had to teach the existing buildings about how to behave.
You mentioned that embodied energy was being talked about in 1980s, and um, it feels like, and I'm just kind of stepping into this world, and so it, to me, it feels like things have started to progress, or at least the conversation around embodied carbon has started to progress pretty rapidly. But I guess from your perspective, do you think that's true, or is it still moving very slowly?
Oh, stop, you're both right. I mean, it's just one of those things where, you can get really depressed realizing that in 1972, was the first, things that I'm aware of that were being published about climate change and global warming and human causes of it, and what is in a lot of ways a very straightforward transition to stop doing that. And certainly by the early 80s, it was understood well enough so that, we really could sort of see the arc that we were following, an arc that was taking us to the disaster that, actually we're beginning to really sort of see it today. We're beginning to experience it today. And so that was a long time ago. That was a lifetime ago, and so how much progress have we had during that period of time? Not nearly enough. On the other hand, when you start to measure things in terms of the Paris Accord, which was signed late 2015, it's about to be 10 years from now. We're just coming up on the 10th anniversary of the Paris Summit. And to realize that there's many governments that have really, really realigned what they're doing. There's many industries that have really, really realigned what they're doing as a result of that, and how profoundly that has changed in less than 10 years. That's amazing. It's something really to celebrate. And I can say that, architects specifically have really had a big role to play in making that happen, not just within our profession, but within this larger field of understanding cities and human habitation, and for that matter, the industry and the agriculture and the transportation that are related to them. So it's kind of both realities are real. They're both real, and, you can decide to get depressed that it's not 1972 and we didn't do anything about it, or get energized about what we do in, 2025 and 2026.
That's a good way to look at it, and puts you more in, I guess, in the seat to do something about it. I do want to get more into the carbon discussion, but I wanted to jump back to something you said earlier about how you, through your journey in your architecture practice, kind of flipped the script and started to look at these older buildings about what you can learn from them. I'm curious, what were some of the things that you thought these older buildings had to teach us about architecture today?
I think there's really, two things that have really been the main, uh, awakenings. One is recognizing just how new what we're doing is. You know, So I'll just give you an example, and I hope I get a chuckle out of this, but I have a question for you. What do Cleopatra, Aristotle, uh, Joan of Arc, uh, Leonardo da Vinci, Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth I, Benjamin Franklin, Marie Curie, what do they all have in common?
Oh no, I don't know.
Yeah, that none of them ever lived in an air-conditioned building.
Mm,
Okay, so
yeah.
we really, in places like here in the US where we have everything is air conditioned, every car is air conditioned, every building is air conditioned, we really think of a life without air conditioning as something that we'd have to suffer through. And let's just remember that people didn't just survive not having air conditioning. Shakespeare wrote all the great plays without air conditioning. Leonardo had all those great thoughts without air conditioning, etc. So the world thrived in the pre-modern era. It didn't suffer; it thrived. We've had as much suffering in the modern era as in any period. So so that awakening it made me realize that, oh, wait a minute, let's look at the what that means in terms of the buildings. And uh, so in the first place, what we've been doing is less than 100 years old. The really kind of the real sort of coalescing of modernism into the things that we see every day in our cities and the buildings that every architect, for the most part, almost every architect in the world builds to this day. It's since World War II. This is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. So we've been doing this for 80 years. It's very new. And from the perspective of 6,000 years of built heritage, um, we're still in the sandbox. We're still children trying to figure out how to make this all work, and we're not doing it very well. We're getting as many answers wrong as we're getting right. And so the building technology side of it was the thing that, as a building reuser, I started to really, again, I sort of started like, oh, old, bad windows, single glazed, wood frames, no thermal breaks, no insulated glazing, etc. Bad technology. And then over the years, like, wait a minute, I've restored 300-year-old wood windows to full operability. No one is ever going to say that about a thermally broken insulated glazing system because in 40 or 50 years, the seals will fail, and you can't repair them. You can't take them apart and recycle them. You throw them in the landfill. The only thing that's in what we build that is really kind of recyclable is the aluminum that's used to make a lot of curtain wall. That's a recyclable material. It's so valuable that people will go to the trouble of taking the the water control systems out of them, the pieces of vinyl that are integrated into them and the thermal breaks that are integrated into them, and they'll remove them and they'll reuse the aluminum. But everything else goes in the landfill. So it's like, so which one of those technologies is better? And repairability, reusability, uh, long life, to me, is more important than what the R value of the window is. And so what I also learned is that, hey, put storm windows on the window, and that immediately, really increases its performance. And then you start to study, well, what were actually historic windows? They had awnings. They had shutters on the outside. They had thin curtains on the inside for when you wanted to have light but have privacy. They had heavy curtains on the inside when you needed warmth. And so actually, in the way that people actually used historic fenestration, in those days with all those, the heavy curtains and the actually shutters on the inside too, the thermal performance of those walls and those windows wasn't the bad things that we make them out to be. Yes, we can make glazing that's triple glazing that is a thing that performs really well until you have to throw it out. But holistically, are we really making better buildings today? My answer to that is no. I think we're you know Go get on a plane, go to your favorite place, look around at the architecture, and ask yourself, is the architecture we're making today as good as that architecture? I don't think we're making good buildings today.
Yeah, that's such an interesting perspective and something to think about too, because they were building without knowing that they could just attach an HVAC system. So they were designing and building for keeping things thermally regulated.
I like to talk about the three things that I think are really what differentiate traditional architecture, 6,000 years of built heritage, from our last 80 years of what we think good architecture is. And the three things that I talk about are, number one, permanence. We think that buildings, for architects to even think about the life of their building longer than the 40-year mortgage that the developers worried about, or the bond issue that the school system is worrying about. And for architects to literally be thinking hundreds of years down the road, that doesn't happen very much. It's a rare thing, like, I don't know, the Obama Presidential Library or something, where both the client and the architect are talking about a building that has legacy for literally hundreds of years. Um, but so that's the first thing, and I think that us not being uh, aware of how permanent our buildings are is a cop out, that we literally don't think about designing them so we understand how they come apart and go back together, and what needs to get fixed in a short time, and what can last for hundreds of years, and without hardly doing anything to them. So we sort of cop out that way, and then we also cop out about understanding what we're doing to build community, and how much are buildings contributing to the life of the community. And the patrons of the architecture that we admire, many of them knew that they would not live to see their projects completed. They were legacy projects. They were for the city. They were for the glory of God. They were, whatever. They were motivated by a lot of different things, but they understood that they were legacy, that it wasn't for what they were doing now, but what for future generations would have the benefit from. And the same with the materiality, that there was a sense of, stone, in Rome, the palaces that were built in the Renaissance in Rome were built from the stones that the Roman Empire was built with 1,000 years before. There was a sense of the permanence of architecture, and there was a sense of, really building for generations. And we've lost that to our detriment, and our cities are poorer for it, not richer for it. They're poorer for it.
Getting into the carbon discussion, maybe to sort of kick things off, in your book, you note that while many of the sustainability rating systems have really done a lot to change the practice of architecture for the good, but that they're, I guess, when you start to look under the hood, that many of the solutions that they endorse don't actually make for more sustainable buildings. So I just wanted to see if you could expand on that.
Well, I think that there's two parts of that are really significant. One, we've already talked about, just literally, what do we think building technology is today that's good? And my perspective on dealing with old buildings, and in the U.S., our old buildings are new buildings compared to what they are in many parts of the world, where hey, a 300-year-old building here in the U.S. is like ancient. There's a lot of places where the 300-year-old buildings are the new buildings. You know, but so that the materiality side of it is important, and the really understanding the longevity of what we're designing and investing our materials and energy into. But the other is the balance between operational emissions that are from using our buildings, using energy consuming systems in our buildings, is what it really comes from. And then the embodied emissions. And actually, as Lloyd Alter prefers to use the term upfront carbon, because it's not really embodied. It's not in there. It's not in there. It's out in the atmosphere already. But we use the term embodied to really describe the the carbon pollution that was created to make the materials and construct the building, that are embodied in the building the day you walk in the door of that newly finished building. Those emissions are already gone. They're already in the atmosphere. You can't get them back. And the idea that you're operating a building that's more efficient and therefore you're recovering those emissions, just a misnomer. You're not recovering them. They're there. They're in the atmosphere for the next couple hundred years. That's what happens with CO2. And there's no getting it back because you're operating an efficient building. You're just being less bad because you're operating an efficient building going forward. But you're still polluting, and what you did to create that building, that pollution is gone. There's no getting it back. Let me just give you an example of electric vehicles as a kind of an analogy. A lot of people can really get their brains around this. So electric vehicles, there's no tailpipe. There's no what in the business is called scope 1 emissions. There's no direct emission from the car. You got rid of that completely. Fantastic. It's not a gas guzzler anymore. Every mile that you drive, it's not polluting the atmosphere from what comes out of the tailpipe. On the other hand, you have to charge your electric vehicle. And where does that power come from? The power comes from our grid. And what's our grid? Well, our grid's dirty. Our grid is still 64% is the current number here in the United States, generated with either natural gas or coal, some oil still. So 50% of our electricity is generated with polluting energy. So your electric vehicle is better because it's being charged with not completely horrible energy. Only 2/3 of it is horrible, and so that's called what scope 2 emissions, the emissions that come from our power use. So you've improved things in that regard, but it's not zero. Okay, you have your operational emissions are not zero. They're still there. They're down to about 1/3 of what they were before. And then the embodied emissions, you still had to buy a car. You still had to make a car. You still had to make a car out of steel and glass and plastics. And, they still weigh 3,000 pounds. The footprint for making an electric car, that is the upfront carbon for making an electric car, is actually more than for making a gas guzzler, because you have to make the batteries. So, okay, that's scope 3 emissions. So, okay, electric vehicles, that's our great future. And I'm not against electric vehicles. Yes, let's make electric vehicles, but let's understand that it's not a true zero solution. And then just finally, a city that's gridlocked with electric vehicles is not a good city. Any more than a city gridlocked with gas guzzlers is a good city. We have to get back to what really good cities are. And they're cities for people. They're cities where your neighbor is your neighbor. Your neighbor is somebody that you meet pushing a baby carriage down the sidewalk. And you go, oh, you have a new baby. That same neighbor with that same baby in a car is traffic obstruction and is in your way, and you honk at if they don't start driving when the light turns green. So what are we doing with our cities? What kind of society are we creating with our cities when we design them around cars instead of designing around people? So electric vehicles solve one kind of problem, but it doesn't solve the industrial level problem at all. In fact, it makes it worse, and it doesn't solve the cities for people problem either. So let's just be realistic and have our eyes and ears open to what the true scope of what our modern era solutions are. We're still constrained by thinking, oh yeah, I need a car to do everything. Well, we lived for all the way until the beginning of the 1900s without them. Most Americans in 1950, when they came back from the war and they started to live in the modern era world that we're 80 years into at this point, most people still didn't have cars. They took the trolley to work. They took the bus to work. They took the train to work. They walked to work. And in these 80 years, we've made it so that, oh no, you're not allowed to live in this world without a car unless you're in a very unusual situation, which is, a central city where it really is walkable and it really is served by transportation. So we need to really understand what models we're following.
That is really interesting to think about and consider that these cities have been really built around transportation versus people. And also, thank you for breaking down the differences between scope 1, scope 2, and 3. That was something that I was having a hard time wrapping my head around. So it's scope 1 is direct, scope 2 indirect, and scope 3 is the embodied.
Yeah, those are the terms that are used. And just let me also just note that the terms scope 1, 2, and 3 were really developed for product development. Okay, so it's sort of, and remember that a lot of this at the early stages of this, it was all focused on energy. Carbon wasn't even the metric yet. It was really focused on energy. And so the idea of a product is that you would have upstream and downstream emissions. So you would have your plant in which you were making your product, and that would be the direct emissions. That would be your scope 1 emissions. And then the upstream and the downstream emissions would come from a bunch of different sources. One source was power use. So they said, okay, well, let's call those scope 2 emissions. Okay, those are power use emissions. Great. But then you have upstream and downstream emissions that are not that. It's oh, somebody had to drive their product that you're assembling in your product to your factory, and they had to manufacture that. So that was an input from a downstream input into your product. And then you assemble your product and you make your product, et cetera. And then you would ship your product out and it would go to a store, and the store had to be there in order to sell it. And then that would be a downstream, emission. And I think I just said, excuse me, the previous one as a downstream, the previous one is an upstream emission. And then now these are your downstreams. And so buildings, we just call those embodied, and that term for scope 3 has been used in industry, embodied emissions. But buildings generally, we don't think of downstream emissions from buildings, because those downstream emissions, like, oh, we create sewage and the sewage needs to be treated, we look at that as a municipal carbon burden, not as a building carbon burden. And the transportation that it takes to come to work in your building, again, we look at that as, oh, that's transportation. That's the city's transportation burden. So the scope 1, 2, and 3, upstream, downstream, direct, kind of product mindset, making that really align with buildings is a little funky. So what you just described as direct emissions is the fossil fuels that you're using in your building. It is the kind of the tailpipe emissions of your buildings. Those are the direct emissions, scope 1. Scope 2 is the power you're using in your building. And as we said, today in this country and in most countries, that power is mostly polluting. And then the embodied is the scope 3 emissions. What did it take to make your building?
Thank you for clarifying that. You brought up some interesting points about the other, I guess, carbon producing factors of a building after it's all completed. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions, perhaps, when it comes to carbon among the architecture community, or I guess anybody working in the built environment?
There's a very simple answer to a very complex question. Okay, and I don't mean to be flippant about it. In a way, it really can be, the framework of it is actually pretty straightforward. So, our buildings, the direct, indirect, and embodied emissions from our buildings, how do you look under the hood, as you said, and really understand them. Well, for the direct emissions, um, everything that we do in buildings, cooking, heating and air conditioning, water heating, those are all things that can be done with non-fossil fuel alternatives, with electric powered alternatives. So, and we're at a point in the development of that technology that many of those technologies are way better than what the gas powered versions were. I'll just use the example of the heat pump and the mini splits, that are in a lot of buildings where you have your little heat pump that's mounted in every room. They're so much more energy efficient than any of the gas powered equivalents. Just incredible, really real technological revolution. LED lighting is probably the best example that everybody's familiar with. And what's the hardship of using LED lighting instead of fluorescent or incandescent lighting? None. There's really no downside to it at all. It's so much more energy efficient. So, we can really eliminate the direct emissions in our buildings completely. All electric buildings have zero direct emissions in them. Okay, why? Because all of the energy that we're using is from scope 2. It's from the grid. We are using electricity that is being generated elsewhere. And the thing that's true about buildings, which is not true about a car, for example, a vehicle, is that we can put solar panels on our buildings. So we can actually generate a lot of the power that we use in buildings on our buildings, on our building sites. And I'm sure the concept net zero energy. Um, it's possible to design buildings, even though they're grid tied, that have so many solar panels or whatever the source of renewable energy is that you're directly tied to, that your annual energy bill is zero. You're generating your power yourself. So therefore, to get to the point where scope 2 emissions are also zero, it's possible. There are buildings that are essentially off grid. And then uh, embodied emissions then becomes the real difficult one and the one to really focus on. So what are you making your building out of? What are the upfront carbon that's associated with making your building? And the conversation today is a lot about using biological materials, materials like wood or bamboo that actually sequester carbon in their fibers because they're made out of plants that do that. And then really using those materials. There's also the idea of using materials that have been recycled or in other ways have really reduced the carbon emissions, the upfront emissions from making those materials. The one that is kind of talked about the most and is kind of an interesting story is steel. Steel is the definition of heavy construction. It's a definition of heavy industry. The giant furnaces in Pittsburgh and things like that. Incredibly energy intensive industrial material. Well, today in this country, largely because of sort of where we are in our own industrialization cycle, most building steel is recycled steel, upwards of 90%. Reinforcing steel, upwards of 95% of reinforcing steel is recycled steel. Recycling steel is oftentimes done instead of blast furnaces, what are called electric arc furnaces, and they're driven by grid power. They could be driven by a clean grid if we had a clean grid. So steel is actually an example of a building material that is truly recyclable. You can take steel and you can make new steel products out of it. And then do it in such a way that it is most of the manufacturing process is actually done with renewable energy. So it's actually, of all the things, kind of incongruously, steel is actually one of the things that has lowered its carbon footprint the most in the building industry in the United States of America because of those factors. Kind of the opposite one is concrete, and very, very carbon intensive material. And in fact, the carbon emissions from concrete are 8% of global emissions just to make concrete. 8% of global emissions. The only countries that make more emissions than concrete are the US and China. Just that, so literally there's no country in the world that pollutes as much carbon as making concrete does, which is mind-boggling. So obviously the concrete industry is really trying to figure out what to do about that. And there's some really interesting work that's being done. And, there's real hope that, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, whenever it will happen, that concrete will no longer have to be this enormously polluting material, and that there will be alternative approaches of building out of concrete that really are even potentially carbon sequestering, not carbon polluting.
My mind keeps going back to, I mean, aside from some of the designers, architects who are building with natural bio-based materials, it feels like, especially with the electrification of buildings or perhaps using solar panels, that you're just shifting maybe the carbon load from one scope to a different scope. Is that the case, or am I overlooking something?
I think actually you're not missing it at all, and that it's kind of where we are in the process. So there are buildings that are truly carbon sequestering buildings that have been built. People have been building, hay bale buildings and things like that for a while. I mean, it's possible. Most of the buildings we build today are built by the construction industry in this country. And the construction industry in this country is very complex. There's hardly a material that you use in a building that isn't part of a global supply chain. So here in the U.S., most of what is actually not a global supply chain and is actually resourced locally are kind of two building products. One is brick made out of earth. It's actually kind of surprisingly local. Stone in this country is surprisingly local. It's kind of hard to transport. There's no real reason to transport it for great distances. Um, uh, so that's something that we kind of overlook. And the only other thing I'll add about that is that the brick that we make today is sort of maximizes its carbon pollution. The way that we make brick today, we're not thinking about making it energy, efficiently energy wise. We weren't thinking about, we were making the most sort of industrial perfect brick that we could make. There's actually a lot of improvement to how we could build out of earth, and there's I think a lot of really interesting work that's being done by people building earthen architecture. Rammed earth is one of the things that we hear a lot about. We like it from an engineering standpoint because it's a lot like concrete. But Adobe is a completely real building material. Why we don't build with Adobe in this country is frankly a bias that we have. There are 1,000-year-old Adobe buildings all around the world. About a third of the world population lives in clay buildings that are not fired brick, that are just, Adobe and cob, unfired, sun-dried brick. There's a lot of potential with earthen architecture, but the other product that we get pretty locally is 2x4s. That there are both East Coast versions and West Coast versions of growing lumber to be used as a building material, unprocessed. Pretty straightforward. You cut down the tree, you chop it up into little pieces, and you use it in the condition that you got it from the tree. There's also a whole slew of engineered wood products things like mass timber, we call it, but which is actually today not even really truly it's mass timber. It's assembled timber. It's cross-laminated timber and other glue-laminated timber products. So again, those are great. They're really made out of oftentimes truly locally sourced materials, but they're much more processed. And again, they're part of this kind of industrial uh, construction industry. And oh well, what are the fasteners that are being used to put to fasten the glue laminated timber together and things like that? Oh, they came from China. So it's very almost everything in our construction industry is tied to these very massive, very hard to understand, very hard to research, very hard to verify what their embodied emissions are, also very hard to emission what their labor practices are and things like that. So what are the kind of worker abuse issues that are associated with that? And I don't mention that casually. It's actually a big issue. And the construction industry is actually the largest industry in the world in terms of the number of people that it employs. And it is also the one that is most vulnerable to labor abuse. And you just think of it, a lot of what we do, oh, go cut down that bamboo. It's so easy, even a child can do it. And guess what? There's a lot of places in the world where the bamboo is being cut down by child labor that's forced child labor. There's a lot of what is, really serious worker abuse in these global supply chains. There's an organization called Grace Farms, which really studies this and has has issued guidelines. They call it Design for Freedom guidelines for architects to use, almost like we use with energy modeling or looking at building life cycle or things like that, to really look at the supply chains that you're using for the materials that you're using and really try to understand where that worker abuse vulnerability exists. And that's something that architects ought to be doing.
Yeah, Grace Farms is doing some great work and has published a lot of many great resources. With certain materials, it's just extremely complex to calculate the true embodied carbon, whether that's from a lack of visibility into the entire supply chain or perhaps a lack of transparency. Is it possible to calculate the true carbon impact of a material?
Yeah, so we're beginning to be able to say yes to that. And I would just tell you that it's early, okay, in the process. And let me just give you one little anecdote on that. I was at a UN hearing a couple of years ago where the embodied emissions, kind of the vice president in charge of embodied emissions for Unilever, which basically makes soap and that's the kind of the household products, and BMW were talking, and they were comparing the challenges of trying to get down to what are the embodied emissions for making a car versus what are the embodied emissions for making a bar of soap. And it was just fascinating that products that were that different, both of those real experts were saying, this is so hard. This is really, really difficult. In order to understand scope 3 emissions, embodied emissions, you have to go down the supply chain to somebody that is doing work that they have scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And what are their embodied emissions? Go down the chain to a place where they have only scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And you keep going down the chain where you can get to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions so you can actually calculate. The scope 3 emissions are just what gets handed off to the next guy and the next guy and the next guy. And that's how it works. So in the construction world, we're now beginning to ask for environmental product declarations, EPDs. And EPDs are sort of like the lead rating system for products. That it's a protocol that is a third-party verified protocol for a manufacturer of a product to document the all of the environmental footprint of their products. And if you look at, say, for example, life cycle analysis, they're not just looking at global warming potential. They're also looking at other environmental impacts like eutrophication and air pollution and things like that. So they're looking at 7 environmental factors, not just one. So the EPDs, using that same life cycle analysis process, have manufacturers do life cycle analysis on their products, have a third party verify that that's what they've done. And then really, there you go. You now understand the emissions. To just give you an example of one little subtlety in this. So in the concrete world, you have to do that for the batch of concrete that you're using, the particular mix for your project. Where is it being done? It's not just an abstract product. Oh, it's concrete. It's literally, it's coming from this plant. It's being driven in those trucks. It's being delivered 40 miles to your site. It's literally the batch mix from from the batching plant to you. That your EPD has to be for that. It can't be a general thing. There are other industries where it's like, oh, okay, well, Georgia Pacific, they've got an EPD on their wood studs. So that's very generic. Like, okay, that's what takes Georgia Pacific to make their wood stud. But do you really understand everything that got it to your lumber yard and from your lumber yard into your building? So even with something like that, you begin to have gaps. And so that's kind of the magic with EPDs, is to really understand, are you really kind of going from the sourcing the materials to having it in your building? So I don't know whether EC3 is, something that you're familiar with, but it's the calculator that was developed by the Carbon Leadership Forum, both contractors and industry people together, really developed this tool. It is now part of what Building Transparency is now administering it, a nonprofit organization that's administering both that and Tally. So there's both a design phase tool that architects can use to begin to estimate and then ultimately calculate their carbon footprint. And then there's the contractor's version of it, which is the EC3 tool that allows them to track during construction. So things like the gap that I was talking about, like, okay, does it really go, that Georgia Pacific EPD, does it really follow all the way into your building? Well, if you follow EC3's protocol, you do that. You wait a minute, how about the trucks that brought it to a site? So you start to really capture those things as well. So we're in the early phases of that. We have some. Tally is a powerful tool for designers. EC3 is a powerful tool for contractors. There's a lot of really good information that comes out of it. But is it being universally applied? No. It's the rare project. I think a lot of architects use Tally. Very, very few construction projects use EC3. But we're getting there. So we're at the early stages of really getting our arms around embodied emissions.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned some of the tools like Tally and EC3, because I was going to ask you if there were some that you would recommend. And also, thank you for noting the kind of the gap that exists on EPDs. I spoke with Jason Grant from the World Wildlife Fund recently about climate smart wood, and he mentioned that EPDs are not the greatest tool for measuring the carbon impact of wood, just from tracing the true origin of that wood, because mills and even the end supplier, they can get ingredients or wood from all these different sources, and so
Right.
it's
And so I think that that's an important point and sort of indicative to where our industry is and where our professions are in this. Our architects, hey, I'm building out of wood. It's inherently wonderful. That's really great. How much more sort of thoughtful do I need to be about it? A lot of architects, like, that's it. I'm making it out of wood. I'm done. I'm green you know but there certainly are architects that are saying, no, I have to really get into the detail. Where is the wood coming from? How is it being used? What will happen to it when it's not being used in my building anymore? How much of it actually has a long life cycle? Things like that. So there are people that are being thoughtful, but there are people that are just like, oh yeah, hey, wood, I'm done. And the same thing with the industry. I would actually criticize a lot of the wood industry for not being serious about it and saying, oh yeah, we got an EPD for a product that was done in Washington State. Here, I'm handing it to you in Washington, D.C. Use it. Like, this isn't Washington State. This is Washington, D.C. Half of the factors on your EPD don't apply here. So there's a kind of a, you know, we can be lazy about, really doing our homework on these things, and it it happens.
in the book you related this to perhaps some of the frameworks that are suggested with if you're following lead or things like that. um, you mentioned that some of the decarbonization frameworks can hinder the role of design in buildings. Can you elaborate on that?
To some degree or another, I think, this is an architect being an architect. I mean, give me rules that are useful. Don't give me rules that aren't useful. I think that a lot of times when a topic like this is talked about, uh, it ends up going to a discussion about the lead rating system. Because it has been such a big industry changer. I really um, give the United States Green Building Council and Mike Italiano and Dave Gottlieb an incredible amount of credit for changing the marketplace. They really, really did. You know, um, but okay, does the lead rating system really apply well to every project that you can imagine? And doing a lot of existing building work, I can tell you that the answer to that is no, for sure. And there's been a long time now. I mean, you were talking about the greenest building coming out of 2004. Well, 2007 was when that was actually that was published by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in their Forum Journal, and National Trust was very involved at that point, meeting with USGBC and trying to say, hey, look, we're the existing building guys, we're the heritage building guys, and we just we're having trouble using your system on existing building projects. And the USGBC opened their arms and their eyes and their ears and said, help us figure out how to really, have a system that is more worthwhile, in the existing building world. But the kind of anecdote you get out of it all the time is you get 1 point for showers and a bike rack, and you get 1 point for saving a building. Really? I mean, is there any real equivalency there? And so of course the answer is no. But so it's really hard to say, here's my set of rules. They apply to everything. They're always going to be a good idea. There's never going to be a time when they seem to be in conflict with a larger reality. It's just not possible to do that. So I would say that the AIA took the COAT top 10 metrics for measures for design for the COAT top 10 uh, awards process, and they've now rebranded that as the AIA framework for design excellence. And if you look at that framework, it's a much more general framework. It says kind of, here are principles, look at these topics, okay? And it's somewhat more along the lines of what the Living Building Challenge pedals are. It's like, look at these things. We're not going to tell you what the solutions are. We're not going to tell you how many points you get for the solutions the way that LEED does, but we're gonna ask you to look at certain things, and then we're going to give you some ways to sort of measure how you're doing on those things. So there are different ways of approaching it, and and frankly, the AIA framework for design excellence, the Living Building Challenge, and the USGBC LEED system, they're all trying to change practice in a different way, and they all have a place. They all are contributing in their own way.
Yeah, that's true. And in your book, you talked about the Coat Awards and how that shift, that even just them adding the word design, I think, to a lot of the criteria was an important shift.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
What is the most important thing as it relates to carbon that architects should be thinking about, or I guess the next most important step that they should take on their projects to reduce the carbon impact?
So when the Arab oil embargo happened in uh, '73, there was this sudden awareness of energy, and the government spent a long time trying to figure out how to change energy policy and oil import and export rules and all that sort of stuff. And but the people that owned cars got more fuel efficient cars. The people that owned buildings did retrofitting to their buildings to make them more energy efficient. So there was sort of a market response that was really, really powerful, really remarkable. In fact, the 10 years after the 1973 oil embargo, the kind of per square foot energy use of buildings in this country reduced the most that it's ever been reduced in a 10-year period. So people really reacted. Okay. The kind of mindset that existed among architects, but actually also among building owners and contractors and so on, is that use energy last. How can you do something and just not have to use energy? And just give you one example of that to just give you an idea of how extreme this was. You know, in like office buildings, big office buildings, they wouldn't turn the lights off at night because that would shorten the bulb life of the fluorescent fixtures of that particular generation of fluorescent fixtures. And so it was less expensive to just run the lights all the time so that you would maximize bulb life. And the fact that you were, using energy didn't matter because the energy was so cheap. Who cared? Well, when the energy overnight got 4 times more expensive, everybody cared. And so, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to turn the lights off when the last person leaves at night. So it's like, okay, well, you don't have to use energy to light a building that doesn't have any people in it. So let's use energy last. So the carbon equivalent of that, let's pollute carbon last, still isn't in the mindset of people as they're considering how they design buildings, how they operate buildings, how they make buildings. And we have to sort of get to that. And the example that I'll give is operability. I already talked about, hey, Leonardo da Vinci didn't have air conditioning. Well, our idea of air conditioning buildings is that we air condition buildings as a whole. There's a thermostat and it makes the whole building be heated or cooled or whatever. A really good smart building will have multiple thermostats and it will turn up and down the heating and stuff like that. But still, we're building buildings with uh, that in order to be habitable at all, to have light and air at all, we need to be consuming energy. Um, all the way until 80 years ago, literally the Empire State Building, a 100-story building icon of New York City, it was built with operable windows. What in 1934, what did you do if you got hot? You opened the window, in a 100-story building. Okay, so our mode of thinking, like just saying that now, most people will go, "What? You opened the window on the 89th floor?" Yes, you opened the window on the 89th floor. So the our notion of really giving people the tools to operate their own environment in their buildings. They're like, no, no, we have machines for that. We have smart machines for that. You know, uh, uh, but all of those smart machines start with consuming energy as a fundamental. There's no non-energy version of that. So let's think about our buildings, designing them. Let's think about our buildings, operating them, and let's think about our buildings, building them, starting with like no carbon pollution. How can I do that with no carbon pollution? And opening a window is an example of an operability mode that has no carbon implication to it. So where's operability in our world? We've forgotten operability. And I'll just go back to the mini splits I mentioned before. The thing I love about mini splits, I have a 7-room house. Okay. There's a mini split in every one of those rooms. You know, if I'm in this room doing a podcast, which I am right now, I have my mini split on. It's keeping me nice and comfy. It's also keeping the space quiet because I don't want the windows open right now because I'm doing this podcast. So I'm operating what I need to operate when I need to operate it. When we're done with this, I'm going to turn it off and I'm going to open the windows and doors because it's actually a pretty nice day and I don't really need a lot of air conditioning. The rest of the house is not being air conditioned now. So it's just sort of an operational mode idea, just a mindset of let's operate what we need to operate when we need to operate it, not just constantly be running all this stuff because that's what we do. We seal up our buildings and we blow air through them all the time, 24/7, no matter what's happening outside. We light them with electric lights, no matter whether it's day or night. You know, why? Let's not start with a carbon burden in the way we do things.
Going back to kind of how you started this podcast about that cities are designed around cars instead of people, it seems that perhaps buildings in many regards are being designed around technology instead of people. But by giving them the opportunity to operate it themselves, that's kind of the best way you can design for people.
Yeah, the people that are kind of into just things like, oh, you know, the obesity crisis and things like that. Just what constitutes a healthy building? The idea of fit building design guidelines and things like that. So the air conditioned building that's 70 degrees, 50% relative humidity year round, it it's increasingly being understood as a problem. Okay, why is it a problem? Because our metabolisms are adaptive. That literally our bodies are made to adapt to our environments, including our thermal environments. And why do you wear a sweater if it's 65 degrees in July, and you wear shorts and a t-shirt if it's 65 degrees in January? Because your body has adapted. And that actually happens on a daily basis, that your body is literally, built to uh, respond to its thermal and moisture environment, which fluctuates across the course of a day. And, kind of how it relates to circadian rhythms and things like that. So we're just beginning, and we're kind of at the beginning of really understanding what is the actual human dimension to having designed air conditioning systems around what were good machines, not necessarily what were good environments for people.
Is there any question that I should have asked you as it relates to carbon that I didn't ask?
Thinking about uh, greenhouse gas pollution is a sea change. It just like in 1973, all of a sudden it's like, wait, we have to think about energy efficiency. We weren't even thinking about it. Gee, maybe we should switch off those lights at night. I mean, that's kind of where we are now. Like, what does it look like to think about buildings, to think about our cities, and and having carbon pollution be a driver in them. And I don't criticize the people that addicted our buildings to fossil fuels 100 years ago and addicted our cities to fossil fuels 100 years ago. You know, Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, they grew up in cities that were full of horses. I mean, New York City had 250,000 horses living in it in 1900, something like that. That might be 750, but you know, horse excrement was an issue in the city when Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier were children. Okay, the idea that clean machines would clean up our cities, I get it. They did. We don't have to worry about horse poop in our cities anymore. But now what we have to worry about is the carbon pollution that those machines create. So it's like that. We're like Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier going, what are we doing about all the horse excrement? What are you doing about the horse bodies flying in the gutters? So we're at that moment. What do we do about all these carbon polluting sources that we've just taken for granted that's a part of our life? Well, hopefully 80 years from now, it will look very different. And we won't be thinking that we have to have a huge carbon burden for everything we do, because we don't. There are carbon free alternatives to most of what we want to do. And the last thing I'll say is going back to my historic preservation roots in this, is we have an encyclopedia that has 6,000 years of built heritage to refer to. We are literally referring to the last page that was written in the last 100 years. And we're thinking that that's the only page we can work with. We have the entire rest of the 6,000-year long encyclopedia to read. Let's start to read it, and then let's start to figure out how to use it.
I love that, relating it to the encyclopedia. Yeah. I guess history and nature has the answers.
Yeah, exactly.